The moment she unfolded the piece of paper and began to read the rules, something inside my chest went very quiet. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even surprise. It was the sound of a heart slowly understanding that it no longer belonged where it once did. I had lived in my son's house for 3 years. After my husband passed away, my son insisted I move in. He held my hands and said, "Ami, this is your home. You will never be alone again." I believed him because a mother believes the promises of her child the way she once believed his first steps would never fall. At first, everything felt warm. I helped with cooking, folded laundry, and sometimes picked up my grandson from school. I never considered it work. It was love quietly expressed in small daily acts. But over time, warmth turned into politeness, and politeness turned into distance. My daughter-in-law, Sana, became quieter with me. Not unkind, never openly unkind, but distant in a way that felt like a closed door you could not knock on. Then one afternoon, she asked me to sit in the living room. My son was there too, standing by the window, looking outside as if the street was more interesting than the conversation about to happen. Sana sat across from me, holding a folded sheet of paper. "I think," she began carefully, "it's better if we set some boundaries in the house." Boundaries, such a gentle word, yet it felt heavy in the air. She began reading. I should not enter the kitchen without informing her first. I should avoid speaking to guests unless spoken to. I should not interfere in how they raise their child. I should keep my door closed in the evenings to maintain privacy in the household. Each sentence was calm, polite, reasonable, even if spoken to a stranger. But I was not a stranger. I was the grandmother who had once rocked my son through feverish nights, who had sold her bangles to pay his college fees, who still remembered the way he used to cling to my shawl when thunder frightened him. I glanced at him. He still did not look at me. That hurt more than the rules. I listened without interrupting. My hands rested quietly in my lap. Years of life had taught me that sometimes silence protects dignity better than words ever could. When she finished, she looked at me, waiting for an answer. I smiled gently. "If this makes you comfortable," I said softly, "then it is good." My voice did not tremble. That surprised even me. I stood up slowly and walked to my room. I closed the door, not because it was one of the rules, but because I needed a moment to breathe. I sat on the edge of my bed and looked around. The small cupboard, the neatly folded shawls, the framed photograph of my husband smiling in the sunlight of a day long gone. A strange clarity settled over me, calm and steady like the stillness before dawn. This was no longer my home, not truly. A home is not walls or furniture or even memories. A home is the place where your presence feels natural, not negotiated. I took out my suitcase, not in anger, not in haste, just quietly, the way a person folds away clothes at the end of a season, knowing it is time to move on. And in that quiet packing, I felt something break. But I also felt something begin. I did not leave that night. Some decisions, I have learned, should be carried gently like a fragile glass. If you move too quickly, they shatter. If you hold them carefully, they become clear. So I packed slowly. A few clothes, my medicines, the photograph of my husband, the small tin box where I kept letters, old receipts, and tiny fragments of a life that had once been busy and full. I did not take much, because the truth is, when a person reaches my age, it is not things that feel heavy. It is memories. For 2 days, I stayed in the house as usual. I woke early, prayed, and made my tea quietly in the corner of the kitchen when no one was around. I kept my door closed in the evenings, just as the rules had asked. I spoke little. No one seemed to notice the silence growing thicker in the air, or perhaps they noticed and chose not to see it. My son avoided long conversations. When our eyes met, he smiled politely, the way one smiles at a neighbor. That was when I understood something painful but important. Sometimes people do not hurt you with cruelty. Sometimes they hurt you with distance, with indifference, with the quiet decision to no longer stand beside you. One afternoon, I overheard Sana speaking on the phone in the next room. "Yes, she said in a low voice. "It's been difficult. Having elders in the house changes everything. You lose your privacy, your freedom." Her words were not loud. She was not shouting, but each sentence felt like a drop of cold water falling steadily on stone, wearing something down inside me. I went back to my room and sat quietly. I did not cry. The tears were somewhere deeper, somewhere silent where they did not need to fall to be felt. That evening, I called my old friend Farida. We'd known each other for over 30 years. I told her only one sentence: "I think it's time I live on my own again." She did not ask many questions. True friends often understand what is not said. "You can stay with me for as long as you need," she replied gently. I thanked her, but I already knew I would not stay long. I did not want to become another guest in someone else's life. I wanted a small place of my own, even if it was modest and quiet. The next morning, after breakfast, I brought my suitcase to the living room. My son looked surprised. "Amy, where are you going?" His voice held confusion, but not urgency. That too told me everything. "I'm going to stay with a friend for some time," I said calmly. Sana looked uneasy. Was something wrong? I smiled, not bitterly, but peacefully. "No," I said, "nothing is wrong. I just think it is better this way for everyone." There was a silence then, a deep, uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of silence that carries truths no one wants to speak aloud. I picked up my suitcase. My grandson was in his room and did not see me leave. Perhaps that was kinder. Goodbyes are hardest for the innocent. At the door, I paused for a moment and looked back, not at the furniture or the walls, but at my son. He still looked uncertain, as if trying to understand something just beyond his reach. I did not blame him. Life has a way of teaching lessons slowly. Then I stepped outside. The air felt different. Lighter, not happy, not sad, just honest. As the gate closed behind me, I realized something quietly powerful. Sometimes leaving is not running away. Sometimes leaving is the calm way to protect your heart. The first night in my small, rented room felt unfamiliar, but not painful. It was a modest place above a tailor's shop with pale walls, a narrow bed, and a window that opened toward a neem tree. In the evenings, the leaves moved gently in the wind, making a soft, rustling sound. It was not the laughter of a busy house, but it was peaceful. And peace, I was beginning to understand, has its own kind of warmth. The first 2 days passed in quiet routine. I arranged my clothes, placed my husband's photograph near the bed, and slowly settled into the rhythm of living alone again. I cooked simple meals, drank my tea by the window, and let my thoughts come and go like passing clouds. What surprised me most was not loneliness. It was clarity. When the noise of a house disappears, you begin to hear your own heart more clearly. On the third day, my phone rang. It was my son. I let it ring for a moment before answering, not out of anger, but because I wanted to steady my voice. "Amy, how are you?" he asked. "I am well," I replied gently. There was a pause on the other end, as if he expected me to say more. When I didn't, he spoke again. "You left so suddenly." I looked at the neem tree outside the window. A bird landed on one of the branches, light and free. "I did not leave suddenly," I said softly. "I left quietly. There is a difference." He did not reply. The silence between us felt heavier than words. After that call, the phone began ringing more often. Sometimes it was my son. Once it was Sana. She sounded polite, careful, almost nervous. "We didn't mean for you to feel uncomfortable," she said. "We were only trying to organize things." "I understand," I answered calmly. And I did understand, but understanding does not erase hurt. It simply teaches you how to carry it without letting it harden your heart. A few days later, my grandson called. His small voice trembled slightly. "Daddy, when are you coming back?" For the first time, tears filled my eyes. "Soon I will come to see you," I said gently. "But for now, Daddy has her own little place." He was quiet, as if trying to understand a world that suddenly made less sense. That night, I sat by the window for a long time. The street below was calm, and the distant sound of evening prayers floated through the air. I realized then that the regret they were beginning to feel was not something I needed to chase or demand. Regret arrives on its own, like the echo of a voice long after the words have been spoken. A week passed. One afternoon there was a knock at my door. When I opened it, my son stood there. He looked tired, not physically, but in the way a person looks when something inside them has been unsettled. "Amy," he said quietly, "the house feels very empty." I studied his face. For the first time in many months, he was truly looking at me. Not past me, not through me, but at me. There was sincerity in his eyes, but also confusion, as if he was only beginning to understand what had been lost. I invited him inside. We sat in silence for a while. The room was small, and perhaps for the first time he could see the simplicity of the life I was now living. "I didn't realize," he began, then stopped. Some truths are too large to fit easily into words. I placed my hand gently over his. "It is all right," I said softly. "Life teaches us all in its own time." And in that quiet room I could feel it clearly. Regret had begun to fill the silence they once thought they needed. After my son visited that day, he began coming more often. Sometimes he brought fruit. Sometimes he brought nothing at all, only himself, and a quiet expression that told me he was still searching for the right words. We would sit together in my small room, drinking tea from simple cups, listening to the sounds of the street below. There was no television, no distractions, only silence and the slow rebuilding of something fragile. One evening, he finally spoke the words that had been waiting between us. "Amy, I'm sorry." His voice was low, almost uncertain, as if he feared the words might not be enough. I looked at him, really looked at him, and I saw not the grown man with responsibilities and burdens, but the boy who once held my hand across the street, the boy who believed I could fix anything. "I know," I said gently, and I did know. Regret has a way of softening a person, of making them see what pride once hid. A few days later, Sana came with him. She stood near the doorway at first, uncomfortable, as if unsure whether she was welcome. I invited her in, and she sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap. "I didn't realize how my words sounded," she said finally. "I thought I was being practical, but I see now that I was being cold." There were tears in her eyes. Not dramatic, not loud, just quiet tears that seemed honest. I nodded. "Sometimes," I said softly, "we only understand the weight of our words after the silence they leave behind." She lowered her gaze and the room fell still again. But this time, it was not a painful silence. It was a silence of reflection, of people beginning to see each other more clearly. Before leaving, my son hesitated. "Amy, will you come back home?" The question hung gently in the air. I took a slow breath and looked around my small room, the sunlight falling across the floor, the photograph of my husband, the quiet order of a life I had begun to shape with my own hands again. "I will visit," I said calmly, "and you will always be my son. But I think it is better for me to live here now." He looked surprised, but not hurt. Perhaps in his heart he understood. A home, I had learned, is not only a place where you are loved, it is a place where you are respected without conditions. And respect once lost cannot be rebuilt by simply returning to old habits. It must grow slowly with patience and truth. In the weeks that followed, my grandson visited often. We sat under the neem tree outside, and I told him stories the way I once told his father. Laughter returned to my life, but it was gentler now, quieter, like a soft melody instead of a loud song. I was not lonely. I was peaceful. And I realized something important, something I wished I had understood much earlier in life. Love should never require you to shrink yourself. Family should never require you to trade your dignity for belonging, and silence, when chosen with wisdom, can speak louder than any argument. I had not left in anger. I had not demanded apologies. I had simply stepped away. And in that quiet step, I had found myself again. That was my justice. That was my peace.